Next, we have shares for resource allocation. And this is what happens when we're under contention, okay, and virtual machines have to compete with one another for resources. And shares are proportional. There's an algorithm that we call the proportional shares algorithm. And that is, at what ratio for CPU and memory do we allocate resources or schedule resources to virtual machines? And there is a default. And it says high, medium, or low share values. And the default is not medium, but normal. The default is normal. And think of it like shares in a company, okay? The more shares I own in a company, the more rights I have as a shareholder to vote, for example, for the board, okay? The more shares I have in for CPU and memory as a virtual machine versus other shareholders versus other VMs, the more I get to allocate those resources to myself. Once again, this only applies when we're under contention. So even though the share values are always there, we never look at them if there are plenty of resources to go around. Okay? We only look at these share values if some VM's going to have to get in line. In what order do these VMs get in line for resources? Share values for CPU are done by the thousands. Okay? For every virtual CPU that is allocated to a VM by default, we give that VM 1,000 shares. Okay? For every megabyte of memory allocated to a VM by default, we give that VM 10 shares. If we set the value to high, we double that. If we set the value to low, we halve that. Okay? Let's give an example of how this might work. Now imagine here that I've got 3 VMs running on an ESXi host. And this ESXi host is under contention. All of the CPU, in this case, has been consumed on my ESXi host. If each of the virtual machines has an equal share value, then each of the virtual machines have their threads scheduled one at a time and in order. Okay? VM A gets scheduled, VM B gets scheduled, VM C gets scheduled, one thread at a time. Now, that gives us a total of 3,000 shares. I can, if I want, ignore the low, normal, or high and set a custom share value if I want. Now, in this case, I'm changing the share value for VMB to 3,000. Okay? I want VMB to get more access to the CPU than VMs A and C. Think of it like this. VM A gets scheduled, one thread. VM B gets scheduled, 3 threads get executed. VM C gets scheduled, one thread. There's a total of 5,000 shares, and VMB has 3,000 of those. That's 60%. So 60% of the time, VMB will be scheduled. The other 20% will schedule for VM A and VM C. Okay, VM A gets 20%, VM C gets 20%. Anytime the total number of virtual machines change, the total number of shares change, and then the proportional ratio between the VMs changes. Now we power on VMD. VMB still has 3,000 shares, but that's no longer worth 60%. It's now only worth 50%. It's got 3,000 out of the 6,000. Okay? If we power off a virtual machine, we recalculate that ratio. Okay? Don't forget, this only comes into play when we are under contention. One thing that I want to note here is that if you have a virtual machine, say, it only needs 1 vCPU, but you allocate 4 vCPUs to that VM, you over-allocate. Its share value also gets quadrupled. Instead of 1,000 shares, that VM gets 4,000 shares, okay? By the very nature of the algorithm, right? 1,000 shares per vCPU. So now all of a sudden, I've got a VM that only needs 1 CPU, but it has 4 times the priority of other VMs where perhaps I have appropriately given those VMs 1,000 shares. So what's the takeaway? Well, first of all, make sure that you don't hit contention very often. Okay? If you're hitting contention constantly, you need more resources, more physical resources. Or please, power off some VMs that you don't need. Those sorts of things. Buy another cluster of servers. Throw money at the problem. Okay? But also, try to do your best to right-size virtual machines. If a virtual machine, is only needs one CPU, then give it one CPU. Don't give it 4. All right? Now, how do we actually change these settings for reservations, limits, and shares? It's done when we edit the settings of a VM. Right-click on a VM, pull down the menu for CPU here, and we can see reservations, limits, and shares. And we can see their defaults. Pull down the memory setting, and we can see our reservations, limits, and shares there. So that's how we set this. Now, one of the nice things that we can see in a cluster, and in the next module we're going to be talking about clusters a lot, is the total resource allocation of CPU and memory, and even storage for IOPS, right? So if you click on, for example, your host or your cluster, you can go to Monitor, then click on CPU for resource allocation. You'll see all of your virtual machines. You'll see their reservations, their limits, and their shares, and then the share value, and they calculate for you the percentage of resources that that virtual machine will get when we are under contention. Okay, so that does it here for us for these resource controls. Okay? If you have VMs that are more important than others, and you find yourself under contention, then setting reservations, modifying the share values, not so much on the limits, can really improve your environment. Well, it's time to play with this a little bit. In lab number 22, what we're going to do is we're going to create some CPU contention with a little tool that we have running in the VMs called cpubusy.vbs. One of the things that the lab asks you to do is right-click on this and say Open with Command Prompt. It's important that you don't double-click on it, okay? Because then you actually have to kill the task. Right-click on it, open it with Command Prompt. Then you're going to change the share values in your virtual machines, and you'll see how the CPU busy task is affected when a VM has more or less shares versus another VM that's also running CPU busy. It's a great lab, and I hope you enjoy it. Okay? So we've looked at reservations and limits and shares. We've defined these and described some use cases for them as well. When we come back, we'll look at some tools that we have for monitoring resources.